Great. Good evening, everyone. I'm Amy Chester, and I'm the Managing Director of Rebuild by Design, which is located at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. And I'm delighted to be here tonight. I want to especially thank the Institute for Public Knowledge for putting together this amazing event and hosting it on this extremely important topic. And of course, all of our panelists who I'll introduce in a moment. The book we're discussing tonight, Soaking the Middle Class, Suburban Inequality and Recovery from Disaster, comes at a truly important time. We're just 2 weeks away from the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, when we in our region were kind of woken up to the reality of climate change. It's $65 billion worth of damages, 8.5 million people without power, 650,000 homes were damaged or destroyed, killing at least 159 people, 44 of which who lived in New York City. And just last year, we were woken up again to Hurricane Ida, when Ida showed us that every single neighborhood is vulnerable to flooding from heavy downpours. And that resulted in 13 deaths of our neighbors. And it's only going to get worse. For New York City, that means extreme heat and humidity, heavy downpours, droughts, extreme winds, and cold snaps. We're also going to experience sea level rise. The New York City panel on climate change projects that New York City will experience 1 to 2 feet of sea level rise by 2050s. So think about that. If you bought a house today, by the time you pay off your mortgage, sea level will increase 1 to 2 feet. And it will continue to increase to up to 6 feet by 2100. Already 400,000 people live within the floodplain in New York City, and half of those people are people of color, and half of those people are considered low income by our federal government standards. So we're super excited to talk through these issues tonight and to be talking about what is the middle class and who is the middle class with these incredible panelists. And we're gonna learn a lot from Max and Anna. So I'm gonna introduce the panelists now. We have the two authors of the book. Anna Rhodes is an assistant professor of sociology at Rice University and is faculty affiliate at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. She studies how social contexts matter for household residential decision-making and the ways that housing, neighborhoods, and schools shape opportunities and outcomes for children and families. Max Bezris is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he's also a faculty affiliate of the Center for Demography and Ecology and the Institute for Research on Poverty. He studies various housing market dynamics like valuation, segregation, and discrimination. Daniel Adona-Cohen is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's the director of the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative, or CS2, and serves as a member of the graduate group of the Designated Emphasis in Political Economy. He's also a founding co-director of the Climate and Community Project and a co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. He's also co-founder and co-PI of the Superstorm Research Lab in New York City, which is how we met now almost 10 years ago, and was a researcher for Rebuild by Design. And lastly, we'll hear from Lori Peek, who is the director of the Natural Hazards Center and professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Colorado in Boulder. She wrote the award-winning book, Behind the Backlash, Muslim Americans After 9/11, and co-edited Displaced Life in the Katrina Diaspora and the Handbook of Environmental Sociology, and co-authored The Children of Katrina and the Continuing Storm. So panelists, let's begin. We'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Rhodes. Thank you so much for joining in our conversation, and thank you to the panelists and our moderator. Max and I are certainly excited to hear your thoughts and feedback and questions about the book. And as Amy indicated, we're in a moment where we've just watched several major storms cause devastation across Puerto Rico, Florida, and flooding as far north as Nova Scotia. And we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of Sandy. So we're in a moment where we're starting to see communities begin to face the long road to recovery. And what Soaking the Middle Class does is focus us on that long process of recovery, but drawing our attention back to Hurricane Harvey, which made land in August of 2017, just over 5 years ago. A Texas Tribune article referred to Hurricane Harvey as a harbinger of climate change, reflecting the idea that climate scientists are seeing trends that storms are increasing in scope and intensity, and that they're likely to be increasingly wet. There will be more rainfall in storms in the future. And Harvey was representative of many of these trends. It was a slow-moving and incredibly wet storm that dumped about 127 billion tons of water on the Houston metropolitan region, flooding hundreds of thousands of structures and causing over $125 billion in damage, second only to Katrina. So the reach of the floodwaters in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey were really notable, in that a broad range of communities were affected, from some of the poorest to some of the most affluent. This isn't to say that the impact of Harvey was equal in these different places, but it does indicate that places which may have been perceived as less vulnerable in the past will increasingly find themselves underwater in our climate changed future. So this project was really oriented towards wanting to understand what recovery would look like in places that were increasingly going to find themselves underwater, in more and more middle class and more affluent places. So we really decided to focus on that type of community. And recovery can also entail things we don't often get to observe among middle class people or households. Things like having to make unplanned residential mobility decisions, or interacting with government bureaucracies to access entitlements or aid, and asking social networks for help. These are things that we more often get to see among poor households and communities, but to a lesser extent among the middle class. So we were interested in examining what that looked like in middle class places. And we were also looking at middle class households recovering from a disaster in a particular economic moment in time. Commentators have for a long time been talking about the disappearance of the middle class, and we're seeing a bifurcation of American households financially, with many having a more precarious hold on their middle class status. So there were sort of three main drivers that were motivating us as we dug in. One, wanting to look at recovery in middle class places that would be increasingly vulnerable moving forward, wanting to understand how middle class households that might be increasingly financially precarious and reliant on their homes as a source of wealth, what it looks like for recovery for those households. And lastly, there's an increasing amount of evidence that is showing us that climate-related disasters not only reveal existing inequalities, but also exacerbate inequality. And with this project, what we wanted to do was understand not only whether or not we see growing inequality between communities, but also within an advantaged or middle-class community, do we still see growing inequality in that kind of place, a place we might think of as a best-case scenario for disaster recovery and resilience. So we selected one middle-class, majority-white suburban community outside of Houston, Friendswood, Texas, as a site to examine these processes. Clear Creek runs through the center of Friendswood, and it overran its banks quite significantly during Harvey. Over 3,000 homes in this community flooded. And the communities and neighborhoods right along the creek are areas where the median income was quite similar to the Houston metro area median income. So it is, by an income metric, pretty close to what we might think of as a middle class place. It also looks a lot like how we think of stereotypical middle class suburban communities with lots of single family homes and large front yards. So it looks middle class sort of on multiple metrics. We used multiple recruitment strategies to identify 59 households to talk to, and we conducted 4 waves of interviews over a 2-year period after the storm. And we talked to a wide range of folks. So the majority of our respondents are white, reflecting the demographic composition of Friendswood. But we spoke to residents from age 26 to 76, young single folks, married couples with young children, and retirees who had bought their homes in Friendswood as that suburb was being developed in the 60s and 70s. Most of our respondents are homeowners, and during the storm, 80% had over a foot of water in their home. So there's really significant damage to most of these homes, and many were living in single-story homes, meaning that they lost nearly everything. However, only 52% of our respondents had flood insurance coverage when Harvey hit. So the book unfolds following a chronological narrative. So we start in chapter 1, looking at the reasons why people chose to move to Friendswood in the first place. Then in chapter 2, we turn to look at their actual experiences of the storm itself, what they were expecting, what it was like to evacuate from their homes as the floodwaters rose, and what they returned to and saw when a few days later the waters had finally receded enough for them to be able to go back to their homes. We see that even when households only had a few inches of water, because the water sat in homes for days while the drainage system tried to catch up, it often soaked up into their walls and into their insulation, such that people had to remove feet of drywall in order to reduce the risk that there would be mold in their walls as they repaired. So Lena, a mother of 3 in her 40s, described this, saying that everyone told her, you have to start to salvage your stuff fast. And she got back to her house and she was like, what can we take from here? It was totally destroyed. So this idea that anything would be salvageable just wasn't realistic when she finally was able to see her home. So what we turn to then in chapter 3 is the decision that households face. So you've returned to your home, you've seen the damage, and now you have to decide whether to sell and move or to return and repair your property. And this is a type of residential decision that we actually don't observe the middle class making very often, which is an unplanned residential choice made under duress. More often, we see low-income households having to face that kind of residential choice. And what we find is that when folks are facing that decision, they largely returned to the pre-storm plans that they had for their residential future. The exogenous shock of the flood and the vulnerability that it revealed didn't change the way residents imagined their future. Instead, pre-flood plans became remarkably durable and guided the choices that they made. Both choices for mobility, so those who had planned to move in the short term activated those plans to move, and plans for stability, so those who had long-term plans to remain were focused on rebuilding and returning to their properties. So we talked to Tammy and Joseph, a married couple who had recently retired in their 60s, and they had planned to sell their home and buy an RV, but they were helping their youngest child sort of get set up in their own independent household. So Joseph told us, I mean, we would move, but it probably would have been 2, maybe 3 years. But their plans were concrete enough that they had already started looking at RVs. They were touring around to see what their options would be. And Tammy told us that RV just accelerated everything. And Joseph agreed, saying, I don't think any of the decisions we made were just out of frustration, which could have happened, but because we were kicking it around, it just accelerated everything. So they had an accelerated plan to move, but what we saw most commonly was a plan to stay. So Claire and her husband, parents of 3 kids, purchased a house and talked about it as their forever home. So they had a very long-term plan to be in Friendswood. And she told us that they decided to stick with that plan, even though their friends and family were asking questions. She said, like, why don't you just cut your losses and go somewhere else? And she told us that that wasn't actually anything her family ever considered. We knew we were coming back at all times, she told us. We picked this house out almost 4 years ago. Like I said, this is our forever home. Perfect cul-de-sac, love our neighbors, love our neighborhood, love the schools. I mean, we searched and searched for a house that we wanted. So they were reoriented immediately towards focusing on rebuilding and repairing that home. And in some respects, they took the storm almost as a silver lining, or they found the silver lining in the storm because they were able to rebuild and repair their home in a way that made it exactly how they wanted it to be. She told us we were wanting to remodel anyways. So, well, we have the chance to do it now. So we like to say silver lining. So Claire and her husband reflects the most common pattern in our data. 50 out of 59 households, over 84%, chose to return and repair their homes in the wake of the storm. So in chapter 4, then we turn to, so what does it look like within the community as people are navigating this process of repairing their properties? And what we see is that there is a huge outpouring of support. There were Friendswood Strong t-shirts that were being printed and distributed. And there's a really robust social infrastructure within the community of Friendswood. Lots of churches, social organizations, school groups, and other things that were really activated to help people in the immediate aftermath of the storm. And we describe this environment in which people were helping and being helped as the local ecology of aid. So this is not simply the sum of the help that households received from their social networks, but rather this broader environment in which households find themselves in need. And the conditions in this environment include those local resources, these other informal sources of support, their social network assistance that they can access from friends and family, and it includes the prevailing attitudes about offering, asking for, and accepting help, all of which are experienced collectively within the community in the aftermath of the storm. And as the local ecology of aid changes, we find that residents' feelings about asking for and receiving help also change. So we see this robust outpouring of support in the immediate aftermath, such that it almost felt like everybody was universally accepting help, but it begins to fade quite quickly. Kara, a mother of 3, described how the assistance faded even though her need remained, saying, once the holidays hit, starting Thanksgiving going forward, it's been just not the same. People have moved on even though we can't move on. In the immediate aftermath, people just want to do whatever it is to help. So the community was great in that way, but it fades, and it fades before you need it to fade. As this fade occurs, we also see people describing a sense that they're receiving more judgment from others, both those who didn't flood, who are surprised at how long the recovery process is taking, and even some neighbors who did flood, but who had more financial resources and maybe recovered more quickly. So in this changing ecology of aid, despite ongoing need, households came to see help seeking and even accepting offered help as less appropriate and potentially stigmatizing. So our goal in this chapter is to show how seeking informal forms of support in the aftermath of a disaster is an extremely dynamic process that changes quickly over time, and that it's sensitive to context. And it illustrates the ways in which recovery across households becomes quite uneven, and that affects the ways in which people feel like it's acceptable or not to seek out further aid. In chapter 5, we dig more into these different trajectories of recovery that we see households on, and we really see 3 different pathways emerge. And this reflects the broader disaster Matthew effect that scholars talk about, where advantaged households become more advantaged and disadvantaged households often become more disadvantaged in the wake of the storm. This is replicated even within this well-resourced middle-class suburban community. We find that the most affluent households were most likely to have flood insurance, and most were fully recovered within a year, maybe 18 months after the storm. Some even added to their savings if they didn't have to spend all of their insurance money to repair their homes. And they were living in new homes, totally up to 2017 code, everything redone. And the home prices rebounded quite quickly in Friendswood, such that people were benefiting from increased equity in their properties. Another group were able to repair their homes on a similar timeline, but they did so with an SBA loan, often over $100,000 in new debt, which meant that if you would go into their homes, you wouldn't know that they were in really different financial positions. But one neighbor has no debt and the other neighbor has a $400 monthly bill that they're now having to pay in order to pay down this SBA loan, which facilitated their capacity to rebuild. So their financial positions look starkly different in the wake of this storm. And then the last group are those who haven't been able to repair their homes 2 years later. Some have no flooring, others have incomplete walls, their kitchens and bathrooms aren't finished. These households were typically those who were lower income relative to their Friendswood neighbors to begin with, and often didn't have flood insurance coverage. And many of these residents were denied SBA loans, so they didn't have access to that financial resource either. They were making repairs to their homes paycheck to paycheck, and many were uncertain whether they would ever have the financial resources to complete the repairs to their homes. So even though they too are living in this neighborhood where home values are rebounding, given the state of repair in their homes, they're unlikely to be able to benefit from that change. And then our last chapter, we look at the ways that people are thinking about the future. And we find that people are still incredibly uncertain about how to understand their flood risk. They have conflicting information that they're facing. They don't know how to evaluate how much new development might be impacting their risk. They don't know how to evaluate how much some of the mitigation steps that were being taken might reduce their risk. They also have broad disagreement about the role of climate change and how much that might be changing their vulnerability. Even people who were clear that climate change was happening were unsure how much it mattered for their home and what that would mean for their flood risk. So given the uncertainty, we find that people didn't feel pressure to move. They continued to follow their long-term plans for stability, but they did so with flood insurance. So more people were purchasing flood insurance in the wake of the storm. And they also had newly contingent residential plans, meaning they told us they would stay only so long as their homes did not flood again. Mia was super clear about this, telling us, I don't know that I could actually go through that again, referring to the recovery process. She said, I think that my husband and I are both of the mindset that we don't have to live here. We want to live here. And if we want to move, then we can. And if we flood again, we're definitely moving. So she reflects this idea that those future plans may be increasingly contingent for middle-class households. So to wrap up, broadly, what we're finding is that climate-related disasters are an increasingly central component of stratification in the US. Recovery processes accrue more resources to already advantaged households, which amplifies inequality. There is indeed a disaster Matthew effect, and as we see in Friendswood, middle-class, majority white suburban communities are not immune from the stratifying effects of disasters. As middle-class places are increasingly affected by climate-related disasters and climate change, the precarious hold that some households have on their middle-class status will be threatened. So disasters will play a growing role in further dividing the rich and poor and in hollowing out the middle class, propelling some households potentially towards greater wealth, while others are propelled towards downward mobility. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much. I'm excited to hear your comments and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Anna. We're going to turn it over to Lori and then Daniel.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for that overview of the book. That was really eloquent and encapsulated the contributions so wonderfully well. And I just first wanted to say congratulations to you and Max on the publication of this important book. And I wanted to start by sharing that this semester I'm actually teaching a 400 student intro to sociology class. And it turns out that this week is the week that we're covering economic inequality in the class, which is filled with students who are from solidly middle-class backgrounds. And so knowing that this book launch was coming up this evening, I actually took the opportunity this week to share a little bit in the class with the students about your recently published work. And I just wanted to share how much this book and your argument really resonated with my students, and in particular, how these young adults, they are connecting the dots between income insecurity and rising wealth gaps and climate change. And they're feeling that precarity in their day-to-day lives. And so I just, again, I really want to commend you on writing this timely and important book. And during my few minutes today, I want to focus on first just teasing out what I think are some of the major contributions that this work has made to the sociology of disasters in particular. And then I'm going to end by just raising a few questions that I would love to hear you both, two scholars who I admire so much, speak to a little more. And so just to begin, in terms of the contributions, I want to say that this book is such an important complement to some recently published quantitative work that has been led actually by your colleague Jim Elliott, Junia Howell, and other social scientists who have been using secondary data from FEMA to essentially make the point that recovery policies in this nation are serving to widen inequalities. And sort of the takeaway of much of this very important work, not to oversimplify it, but is that definitely that more solidly middle class and upper class people, essentially recovery policies are helping them to improve their status in the post-disaster period, while lower income people of color are more likely to fall even further behind. But as the scholars who are doing that work acknowledge, one of the gaps in that research is that it can't necessarily reveal the mechanisms by which that inequality is reproduced. And it also does not always get at the incredible variability within different social class categories. And that is exactly what your work does. Through your rich, qualitative, in-depth, longitudinal research, you have really helped to explain the mechanisms by which inequality gets reproduced within the middle class, in particular in our nation, by looking very specifically at this neighborhood. And this is really such an important contribution. It's an important contribution in that, as you noted in your remarks, Anna, and you note throughout the book, that the middle class has actually been substantially understudied and has not been as much of a focus of attention in the disaster literature. And so this is another important contribution of your work, the longitudinal scope of this work, and the fact that you systematically gathered data at 4 points in time from these families who were the focus of study is another major strength. As you rightfully note in the book, if you would have stopped just months after the disaster or even at the 1-year point, you would have in many ways missed the story that became the heart of this book. And so I just really want to call up the long-term nature of this work. I also think that all throughout this book, you make such a contribution in terms of helping to really explain why people do or do not behave in particular ways, even in the face of what feels like such clear and present danger. And so why do people purchase flood insurance or not? Why do people mitigate or not, even when they live so close to the water and in such a flood-prone area? Also, you do such an incredible job of shedding light on the recovery process and how it's both so deeply individualized that in our nation, we rely on people, we expect people, especially middle-class homeowners, to have private insurance and to prepare in ways that will allow them to recover in this very sort of atomized way. But then as you show in the book, in order to recover, people oftentimes need to draw on not only resources through their social networks, but also through this outpouring of support that comes in the aftermath of disaster. And so it's a beautifully written book. It's rigorous and it's so well organized in terms of the flow of the book, which was intentionally written to follow the time after the disaster, but also it's the contribution, the sociological contribution and the categories that you use to organize the data that are so meaningful. I just want to close out my remarks with a few questions that I would love. I just wanted to learn more from you as I was reading this work. And those questions I've sort of organized around policy, data, ethics, and process. And so first, policy and recovery policy in particular. And I want to start actually where you end the book. And so in the final sentences in the book, in the final paragraph, you say the following: the prognosis is clear. Without a reconceptualization of what recovery looks like, inequality between neighbors will grow, even in well-resourced communities. Without deep and systemic changes to the process of recovery, Friendswood, Texas, and the country as a whole will become more unequal and more vulnerable. But what I wanted to know from you both, with your expertise, was how should we change recovery processes? Again, you make such a compelling argument in this book, and you illustrate through various data types why recovery is actually driving people back into risky places and is encouraging people to rebuild and to recover in place instead of to perhaps consider a wider portfolio of options when it comes to the post-disaster as well as the pre-disaster period. And so I'd love to hear more from you about what you think that reconceptualization of recovery should look like, both academically, but also practically. Second question has to do with data, and in particular, data on the social and emotional costs of recovery. And so again, you meticulously document what it takes to recover in terms of the money, where the money comes from, where the resources come from, where the time comes from, and the volunteer hours and the sweat equity and so forth. But what I wanted to know as well, you spent so much time in these people's houses and in their homes, observing the families, observing the dynamics, observing the community. And one of the things that we actually found in our research following Superstorm Sandy was that middle-class residents who stayed and repaired actually suffered worse mental health outcomes than did lower income residents who actually left their homes. And at first, this kind of perplexed us. We thought, that isn't exactly what prior research had showed. We thought that lower income residents with fewer resources might have fared worse, but they were actually faring better on mental health outcomes. But as we sat with the data and thought about it, it was like, of course, because the middle class people, they're still in the homes and they're dealing with the stresses of recovery. And so that the mental health issues really may not be as much about the initial disaster as they are about the recovery as disaster. And so I would just love to know more about what did you learn from these families about the stresses and strains of recovery and how that may have been bifurcated as well by class status and recovery status. Third, I had some questions about research ethics, and you did, again, an incredible job in this appendix that you include in the book, talking about the ethical decision-making that you really engaged in thinking about when you were going to enter the field and how you were going to enter the field with great respect for the potential trauma that was unfolding in your respondents' lives. However, because your research was long-term in nature, something I'm deeply interested in is how ethical dilemmas and ethical landmines unfold in the long-term disaster research process. And that is oftentimes something that we don't always write about, and we don't always talk about those ethical dilemmas that may not ever raise to the level of something that would trigger an IRB review, but they are the stuff of which ethnographers have to really navigate and negotiate and think carefully about. So I was just curious about what sorts of ethical dilemmas you confronted over the long term. And then finally, a process question. I think that oftentimes as ethnographers, we're still trained to do ethnography as sole researchers, as individual researchers, even though team-based ethnography is becoming so much more common. And again, you two in your methodological appendix, you just did such a beautiful job there. And I hope it's going to become required reading for people who are teaching graduate seminars in doing qualitative or ethnographic research. And you two wrote so effectively about your positionality as white researchers and what that meant going into this overwhelmingly white suburban community. But I was just left wanting more to understand, how did you two work together? Did you do the interviews almost always together? It sounded like a lot of times you did. But then also, how did you write this book together? How did you analyze this data together and so forth? And so I always love to peek behind the curtain of process when it comes to doing this kind of long-term research. And so I'll pull this over there and turn this back to Amy so that we can hear from Daniel and then hear from you, Max and Anna. And again, congratulations on this beautiful work. Thank you so much.
Those were really incredible questions, and I hope we have time for all of it. But now we're going to turn over to Daniel.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's great to be on a panel with you. It has indeed been basically a decade since we've been doing versions of this work together. Max, thrilling to see you doing this common work, and Anna, thanks for bringing Max along. Environmental sociology, right? And Lori, thank you for those really great comments, which they make me feel a bit like a kind of knockoff phone after a new iPhone release. So I'm a little nervous to follow, but I will do my best. I will likewise just lay out 3 key interventions, which Lori has mostly covered, so I won't have too much more to say about that, I don't think. And then I want to raise kind of 3 questions. 2 of them fairly focus on politics, and a third on situating disaster research and climate social science. So I'll probably reserve a little more time for that, just because Lori has done such a nice job fleshing out the points I was planning to make. So yeah, 3 key interventions. First, I mean, the fact that the middle class is so poorly protected, I think does bear repeating over and over. The whole theory of this country is that it's the middle class's prosperity is the country's prosperity. That has a lot of illusions and falsehoods in there, but nonetheless, I think it is surprising just how unprepared people who are doing well are for this. And, I think reading this book, it was impossible not to think about the devastating recent events in Florida, the enormous numbers of uninsured households that have been devastated, looking beyond that into some of the stuff that DeSantis has and has not been doing around insurance reform. I think all that's quite important. So really getting into detail about just how unprepared the vast majority of people, including prosperous people, are, I think is a huge benefit. And there's a lot of detail in this book on how, which I'm not going to go into. You have both discussed this at length, Anna and Lori, today. Second, driving inequality within the middle class, again, very helpful, raises questions about the salience of the middle class as like a political category, there are cultural questions, there are financial questions, there are questions around wealth, and then there are questions around the privatization of risk. And I think maybe could have done a bit more with that, but essentially, you show very well that this, even within this amorphous category, there's some pretty important differences in people's access to all kinds of social protections, financial, cultural capital, social capital, et cetera. Finally, I think to me, a bigger takeaway that I don't think you made as much hay of as you could have, but you did, is that the reactions to climate disaster that we tend to be seeing, and we just saw a big, large N study kind of confirming this, that the reactions to climate disaster we're finding on the ground tend to be restorationist rather than reconstructionist. That to me is quite powerful. I think one of the things that's interesting in this book is I have tended to think about this, and I think others may have, in terms of political economy. You have a growth machine in Houston that has certain predilections, et cetera, et cetera. You have the political divisions in this country. But also there's this point that people have lives, within those lives, they have plans. And actually it may be the case that the middle class, even more than, let's say, people might be more like tenants or may have moved around for work. You have large swaths of the country that are living a kind of life where they have made a big plan for the future. And an event like this does not cause them to revisit that plan, but in many ways, whenever possible, to kind of double down on it, and to double down on it in a way that doesn't sort of take account psychologically of the fact that climate change is like an escalating threat and a nonlinear threat. So, people looking to past disasters as a kind of quick guide to where the water is going to be is obviously not correct. But you give us a sociological rich account of how individuals may still want to do that anyway. And I think that there's been some work on kind of future, as Mimi Scheller has talked about this, a certain amount. Other sociologists talked about this, but the kind of like implicit futurology of people's life plans and how that may cause people to not take seriously climate change as a sign of, or basically a weather disaster as a sign of yet more disruption coming down the line. So even thinking I could handle this once or twice more in my life, you aggregate that up to the community level and you just have very, very poor response to what's coming. So I think that's very powerful. And I think, as I'll get to in my third question for you, though, I think the reconstructionist versus restorationist account also has to involve carbon pollution. I can't treat this as an adaptation question alone. Okay, so 3 questions, 2 about politics, and then 1 about situating this. The role of party politics is like basically completely absent in this book, mentioned a couple of times. I would like to hear more from you. I use the internet. It seems that this community is, depending on the precinct, 50 to 75% Trump voters in 2020. So this is largely Republican. We have good research from sociologists, including Bob Brill, that elite cues from political leaders have a major impact on people's climate opinion. After the John McCain race in 2008, the Republican Party shifted wholeheartedly into climate denialism. We actually saw a reduction in the number of Republicans that believed climate change was a serious threat. And the best explanation for that I've seen is elite cues from political leaders within the Republican Party who are themselves bought out by people like the Koch brothers, who that scene makes a lot of money out of Houston. So I think that I would love to hear a bit more about why it is that in this place, there's such reluctance to think about this as a climate event. And I do wonder if that would be reproduced in a place like San Francisco or Los Angeles, especially at this time. And so we're just seeing now so many issues where partisan affiliation seems to mediate impacts. There's just a study came out that, conservatives, Republican voters who are friends with people of color are less likely to shift their thoughts of people of color than our Democrat voters. There's questions about this research, but the empirical findings seem pretty robust. So that is also a question about the Houston growth model, but I really want to hear more about the role of the Republican Party in this and in shaping people's opinions. And if it's not what I think, then please tell me. The other one, the second political issue is fascism. This is a big question going forward. Are we going to get eco-fascism? What does the rise of the Trump Republican Party mean? And if we think about increasing scarcity, increasing climate disasters, where does the middle class go? That is historically a big question for political and historical sociology. Dylan Riley, my colleague here, has shown that robust civil society is consistent with the rise of fascism in his work, historical analysis of the European case. It's really interesting to me thinking about the church groups, the social capital, the various people coming together, and then the moment that a year has passed, there's a sort of sense of deserving, undeservingness. If you haven't mobilized, taken care of yourself, then other friends within the middle class we're going to kind of look down on you. And one could imagine what this might look like in a more multiracial or more mixed income kind of like context. So there's a passage here on page 89 I wanted to evoke, which really got me thinking about this. Somebody called Charles is talking, and he says, there's a point in a subdivision where you're going to say, enough is enough. Enough time has gone by. You've got to get back to where we were. There are certain standards that you got to meet, like getting these dang trailers out of here or getting your house fixed up, because that affects all of us. There must be ordinances or health and safety standards. At some point you say, enough is enough. And so this just sounds like all the different ways in which white groups have tried to keep people of color or low-income people out of their neighborhoods, policing the very aesthetics of these like idyllic suburban neighborhoods. So I'm worried about a kind of like Tocquevillian eco-fascist emergence in these places like Florida, places like Texas, elsewhere. And I think you could speak to that. Okay, finally, how do we situate this in terms of climate studies? This is a really powerful book about the way that people do and don't respond to climate change. But I would have liked to see more on carbon pollution. I'm curious if you discussed that. I think there's a version, one could read this book. This is a provocative claim. One could read this book the same if climate change were caused by just increasing solar flares. In other words, if you said, well, there is this exogenous event in the planet, in the solar system, that is causing the world to heat up a little bit, and people have to adapt. Sea levels are rising, storms are getting stronger, there's more water in the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Houston is a major producer of fossil fuels. The American suburban middle class is an overwhelmingly disproportionate contributor to carbon pollution through its lifestyle. So I guess I wonder, how do we kind of close the causal loop by taking a story about confronting climate change and including the causes of climate change? And how do we as social scientists incorporate research into disaster response and adaptation into discussions of carbon pollution responsibility, coming out of this literally exact same built environment and the same local economy? If recognizing climate change means coming to terms with escalating flooding, recognizing climate change also means coming to terms with the causes of that, which are carbon pollution. And that, in a context like the United States, which is a rich country, you can't really separate, the way that we build our communities from the question of carbon pollution. So this is something I've tried to do in my work, particularly in New York, not only, so I'm somewhat like riding in my horse here, but again, I think I want to hear a little bit more about how you connect this to that broader question. And in particular in Houston, right, where now like ExxonMobil is trying to create a carbon capture storage corridor, I really want to get some sense of the linkage between the politics of disaster recovery and the politics of economic development. Okay, thank you very much. Amazing, provocative book. Want to really echo everything Lori said about these enormous contributions, echo what I said. You've put a huge amount on the table, fascinating book, wonderful to talk about. And last comment, really great read, a really, really, really great read. Okay.
And that was also a perfect transition, because we have some of the same questions in our Q&A about mental health and about partisan politics. So if you want, maybe we could start there, and then you can get to the other one.
Sure. Thanks to IPK, first of all, for organizing. Amy, thank you for moderating. And Lori and Daniel, thank you both for these great thoughts and comments and compliments. Anna and I are very grateful you took the time to read the book. Let's start with this political question. I think one thing that is absolutely reflective, Daniel, of your intuition, right, that party politics actually plays a major role here, is that these people didn't mention climate change, right? In the first 3 rounds that we interviewed them, nobody talked about it. It was not a phrase that people use. I think, Anna could correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's maybe mentioned 6 times in, literally over, 120 interviews in their first 3 rounds, something like that. And so Anna and I decided we needed to ask people about this. But I think the fact that it's not even considered when we were talking to people about their risk, right, when we were talking to people about the future, that this is absolutely a reflection of party affiliation, right, and these cues that people are getting from their political leaders. What I would point out, however, Daniel, I think is that, you mentioned, we would be getting very different answers from people in San Francisco or LA, and I think that's absolutely true, or New York. But I don't think people in LA or San Francisco or New York would move either. I don't think that they would be, certainly, affluent or relatively middle-class people, I don't think they'd be changing their lifestyles, right? Even though they'd be saying, oh yes, climate change, absolutely, it's happening, it's what's causing all this. And And that is a systemic problem about alternative places to live and policies, right, that we have for motivating people to leave vulnerable places, right? So I do think that this is right. The sort of rhetoric is a cause of party politics, but I'm not sure that the action, itself that we're describing would be any different if people were more readily able to link their risk to climate change, or more readily, on a rhetorical level. And so maybe this is actually a nice transition to, one of Lori's questions about policy, right? Which is that, like I said, I think these issues are policy driven and systemic, right? The whole point of the book, right, is that policies are making communities more unequal. So what's to be done, right? And this is something that's to be done both in Houston, the suburbs of Houston, or in the Mission District of San Francisco. Well, that's not necessarily the most vulnerable place, but Lower Manhattan, right, is maybe a better example with sea level rise, where we need to be moving people away, right? And what does that actually mean concretely? I think more equitable funding, certainly, in how FEMA gives disaster aid, right? And so renters really get nothing right now compared to homeowners. Lori, as you mentioned, homeowners receive a lot of money, but it's usually geared towards rebuilding, right? I think one thing that Anna and I found is that, there's actually a couple of interventions that could be made both short-term and long-term. Short-term, one thing that we've been thinking about is that after disasters, you could have eviction moratoria and you could have mortgage forbearance programs that would give people the financial buffer, sort of leeway, in which they could actually start to make more proactive decisions about, do we want to live here or do we not? I think a lot of the reasons that people get pulled back are because they think to themselves, okay, I'm getting this money to rebuild my house. I don't really have any other option, right? So that's one thing, right, to sort of give people the room, but then also give them alternatives. And this, I think, is both the short-term and long-term part. The short-term part is FEMA could really easily provide housing counselors as people who get deployed in the aftermath of disaster, who are knowledgeable about the local area, who could be giving people advice about where they might move that is less risky. This doesn't actually solve, sort of the whole problem that our buyout, hazard mitigation right now is very slow and cumbersome. But this is at least, I think, one minor thing that's very cheap in a sort of broad sense that could actually be really effective about mitigating risk, moving people away, engaging more in managed retreat. I think the longer term thing here is designing communities, right? And this is a much more bigger investment, the kind of things that Daniel, you've written about in social housing, right? Things that reduce carbon emissions as opposed to sustaining this middle class lifestyle, which is essentially the most, carbon unfriendly lifestyle that one can imagine, both in terms of the built environment, both in terms of people's consumption, right, and in terms of their transportation. And so one thing that I think Anna and I have talked about after we wrote the book, when we started to think about, okay, we finally got this thing out, what should we be telling people that we can do? I think there's the bigger issues, right, the sort of, like I said, Daniel, kind of Green New Deal stuff that you've been working on, which would absolutely think about how to make more communities in safer places that are more carbon efficient, right? But we also need, I do think we need these kind of interventions like housing counselors, and these financial buffers immediately after disaster to give people the sort of cognitive, mental space and support to actually then move to those places, right, that are both less risky and, more carbon neutral, right, or carbon saving. So I know we have 10 minutes. I'll talk for maybe another 2 or 3, and then we can move on to some of the broader stuff. Mental health, right? This was something that both Lori and I see one of our attendees has brought up. We saw a lot of strain in people's households that they would mention, not super overtly, but tensions in marriages, right, about decision making over, and I think the thing here, Lori, as you pointed out, really is money, right? What's the thing that causes households to have a lot of adverse mental health outcomes, or even just disagreements within them, right? Is a lack of resources, and we saw people admitting, right, that their families were straining, right, under the financial weight of having to have this major expenditure of rebuilding their houses, the length of time that it takes, right, that they're living in these shells of houses, right, it's really, a miserable time for months, even up to a year, right, for a lot of our respondents, who are, can't use their downstairs. They're making food just in microwaves, right? And these are people who have young children. It's really, talk about trauma. One thing that Anna and I think would have maybe done differently had we had more time and money, and was actually maybe have a battery of mental health questions, right? That we didn't really include in our survey. But I think Lori, what you pointed out about your findings after Hurricane Sandy, I think is so key here, which is that people's wealth, right, on paper, or their incomes, maybe more accurately, doesn't necessarily protect them from having these kinds of adverse mental health outcomes and this kind of strain. In fact, because it's that status that they're trying to cling to, right? It's that middle-class community that they're trying to stay in. It's that middle-classness that they're trying to funnel all their resources to right now, just to hold on to, right? And that's obviously going to cause immense amounts of pain, right? And poor mental health. I'll end, and we can maybe turn it to a little bit more discussion. What I really want, just in something that I want to talk about, Lori, that you brought up, which is this collaborative element, right, of this project. And this was an amazing experience, I think, certainly for me, and I hope for Anna as well, right? In both figuring out, right, sort of like how two people can be additive and even multiplicative, right, in the research process. I know we have some graduate students in the chat. What I would say, right, is so to some of the particulars that Lori, that you were asking about, what we did is we started doing interviews together to get a sense of each other's styles, right, to get a sense of how much are we letting the other person, the interviewee, speak, right? Do we have different sort of, so one person would kind of be the primary. We would be able to add things, certainly. And then after the first round, we started doing interviews on our own. And we started to build relationships, and this gets to some of the question of ethics too, with some people that we then individually interviewed multiple times over the next 2 years. And I know that we individually developed, some more special relationships, I think, with some of our interviewees. I know Anna still checks in with a couple of people that I think she feels more connected to, right, in some way. This isn't necessarily, like you said, kind of an IRB issue, but it is one that is omnipresent, right, in long-term qualitative work. And it's one, that I think we're sort of constantly reassessing in terms of if we needed to do anything differently. I think ultimately we were pretty happy with the dynamic. One thing that I will say, we're no longer colleagues, but being able to be colleagues at the time of doing this research, writing the book, was that we had our offices first right next door to each other, and then when we moved into the new building, right across from each other. And the amount of time that we would spend after a particular interview coming back to the office, or working on a particular part of the book or a chapter, or even just a passage where Anna had better furniture, so I would be in her chair in her office. And the joy, and I think also the productivity, right, of being able to sit for literally hours, right, at a time, and bounce ideas off of each other in a way that I think, you rarely get to do when you're doing kind of like a big solo project. I think this book is so much better for that reason. So why don't I stop, Anna? I don't know, if you want to add some things to some of the questions that Lori or Daniel said, or tell me that I'm massively wrong about, how you feel about me.
No, I agree. I think you have hit the nail on the head with many of those responses. I think the one thing I'll add to Lori's question about ethics over time, especially in a disaster research context, is that we continue to see people with intense need years later. And so I think this kind of longitudinal research raises questions about when and if you should intervene and how. And that's something that I think we should be having more ongoing conversations among scholars within this space about what that looks like and what the ethics of that should be. So I certainly had some conversations with people about how they might reach out to different resources or how they were identifying different resources. And as time progressed, I got more and more on the side of saying, well, do you want me to call someone? Can I be helpful to you in some way as you try and navigate the bureaucracy and challenge of this? And I will say most of these residents were particularly independent about it. They didn't necessarily want me to step into that role, but as we started hitting 18 months, 2 years, I was more moving in that direction of having some of those conversations among our residents whose homes are still incomplete years later. And that's something that when you do this kind of longitudinal work, you start to see those issues emerge and people struggle to navigate recovery in the long term. So I think that's something to put on the table for disaster scholars generally to be talking about as issues of ethics that emerge over time.
One thing
I'm going to just jump in with the.
Oh, go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to jump in with the last question because I think it's really interesting and I think you're touching on it. And it's this question about, you talked about why you chose middle class and that there's not a lot of research that's been done on the middle class. And the question is specifically about home value going up. And just today in New York City, the controller released a report saying that in the floodplain in New York City, the values have gone up 38% since Hurricane Sandy 10 years ago. It also kind of connects to that question about retreat and what's considered fair, because a lot of people who do retreat do first ask for their pre-storm value, not their post-storm value. So just wondering how all of these kind of questions together get into that, kind of aha moment and realizing that not everybody is worse off after the storm eventually.
Yeah, I mean, this ties to, I see Dana's question, right, about the return of home values in Friendswood, which seems counterintuitive. I do think that a lot of this, in the way that we talk about it in the book, I think is that, and I think a lot of this has to do with the whiteness, right, of Friendswood. Houston is a rapidly diversifying metro area. Friendswood remained extremely white throughout this diversification. As she described, it's a very bucolic sort of looking suburb, very desirable. There's actually not been a ton of development recently, right? So it's contained. And so that obviously, I think, if we're thinking just in terms of supply and demand, there's a low supply of housing stock in Friendswood. Moreover, the schools there are very highly rated and have sort of a metro-wide reputation of being very, very good. So I think this is actually why we don't see a sustained price decrease in a place like Friendswood. And I should say that other research has confirmed this, right, in other places as well, that white neighborhoods actually see, and Amy, you alluded to this, right, you see a reversion, right, to pre-storm housing values much more quickly in white neighborhoods and a much more rapid and a much higher return. And so this has to do, I think, a lot more getting at some of what Daniel was talking about too, which is that middle classness, right, and whiteness, right, and sort of like a potential, really ugly future where it's only a certain kind of person who is advocating, in an effective way and then getting, right, their payments, right, to be bought out, while, people who are not middle class, right, not white, who are left, I think, to be in these most vulnerable places is not an impossible future. And I'm not, I don't really know what to do. I mean, that's a big question, but I do think Daniel's right? It's something that absolutely have to contend with.
I think we have just a minute left. Any last words that any of the panelists are dying to get out there?
I'll just reiterate, thank you, everyone who to Daniel, Lori, Amy, to the IPK team, everyone who showed up. Anna and I, I'm sure, would love to answer further questions by email. So please let us know if you have any.
Great. And with that, I also want to remind everybody that there is an Environmental Bond Act on the ballot in New York State on November 8th. That's going to set aside $4.2 billion for ecological and flood resilience and many programs. You can find out more in many places, including Rebuild by Design's website. But do not forget to turn over your ballot and vote yes for the Bond Act to help people in need, just like what we're talking about here. So thank you, Max and Anna, for writing this book. Thank you, Daniel and Lori, for having such incredible questions. And thank you, Sam, for keeping us all on schedule and doing all the tech that is so important in these chats. And thank everybody for coming. Have a great night.
Thanks, all.